The impudence, the audacity, the unmitigated gall of those Knuckleheads of Liberty podcasters, daring to voice opinions outside the mainstream of accepted thought. Listen if you dare. It's angry, it's funny, it's even sometimes sad, but it's always based on freedom and justice, as you will see. Here's our host, Jason McPhee.
It is March 27th, 2023, and welcome to the Knuckleheads of Liberty, where we are bringing you the people and the organizations fighting for liberty around the country and in your region. Today, we have back with us James Burling. He is the Vice President of Legal Affairs at the Pacific Legal Foundation, and we just interviewed him on another show that you can go check out as well, where we really got into his background and what the organization does. But today, we're actually going to get into a few of the cases that they're fighting on. But before we do that, let me introduce you to the rest of our panel. In our upper left-hand corner, we have Leon, the word Brathwaite, last word in liberty. He is a retired engineer in the state of California. In our lower left-hand corner, we have our screaming eagle of freedom, Tim Everett. He is a pilot in the state of California. Upper right-hand corner, we have Jim Burling from Pacific Legal here to walk us through some of the cases that they're fighting on. And my name's Jason McPhee, and I'll be your host today. So one of the biggest things that we've been up against is just the bulldozing of our constitutional rights that government COVID policy has brought us. And one of those things was, if you thought you owned a house and were able to rent it, or in some cases even just to hold it empty, you may have found that your rights were just completely bulldozed by the government. Maybe that house you thought you owned may not really kind of be yours in some sense, because you pretty much have to do whatever the government's telling you have to do with it. And what we found in California was that essentially there was this eviction ban going on, and it happened across the country in a lot of places, but it definitely was extended in California a lot longer than a lot of places. And essentially people who were renting, and if they had a bad renter who wasn't paying, or somebody who got into a situation where they couldn't pay because a government lockdown was not allowing them to make a living, now suddenly the government's saying, hey, well, don't worry, this guy, let's see, this guy's name here I think is John Williams, I think his name was. Don't worry, John's got a home, you can stay at his place, the government will tell you, right? And this is essentially what the government was doing to you if you were a landlord. Their policies were making it so people couldn't pay, and then they said, don't worry, John's got your back, or somebody else. And in John's case, he wound up renting to some gal who was I guess a little bit didn't have the best ability to pay, but I guess he felt sympathetic to her. But around the time that COVID kicked in, now suddenly she became somebody who just wasn't paying, and then he found out all kinds of other crazy stuff, like maybe she could pay, but she didn't want to pay. I mean, she literally had businesses running off the property and in other places, so it's just kind of crazy. And he found that his hands were tied, and he still had to pay the bills and everything else. It's just an absolute nightmare. And this kind of thing was happening all over the country. Mom and pop landlords were just finding out that they were, completely, just their rights were being trampled. So, John, James, or Jim, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what was going on in this particular case and in some of the other cases you guys are representing here? Because you guys are actually representing John, aren't you?
Yes, we are. And we've represented a number of other landlords as well. And so when we talk to the word landlord, let me put that in perspective. Generally, we're talking about not only corporations that own big apartment buildings, but we're talking lots of mom and pop landlords. They own a duplex here, they own maybe a triplex or a fourplex. But these people were steamrolled with the eviction ban just like everybody else. But they suffered especially because they don't have the wherewithal to give. So we have people that were renting out their homes, sometimes at cost, sometimes giving a little favorable treatment to their tenants. And all of a sudden, the eviction ban comes into place. Now, we had the nationwide eviction ban that President Trump and then President Biden put in place. That was declared unconstitutional. We had a lawsuit over that because they did not have statutory authority to do that. But we also had the states pass their own eviction bans. Here in California, it was first the Judicial Council, of all things, decided that the courts could not be used for unlawful detainers or evictions anymore during the COVID crisis. Well, the court completely lacked the authority to do that. The Judicial Council lacked the authority. The state statute says that the court shall be a forum for a unlawful detainer action. So if you need to evict a non-paying tenant or a tenant that's destroying your property, you go to the courts. The Judicial Council didn't have authority. So we filed a lawsuit, and shortly thereafter, the court issued an injunction, but it wasn't to go into effect for another couple months in order to give the legislature time to pass its own eviction moratorium, which the legislature did, because this is California. Also, you had cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco that passed their own, and then counties started passing them as well. So you have this different layers, multi-layers of eviction bans. So you have landlords like a number of our clients, and you go into our website, you can see some really hard luck stories of these small mom and pop landlords. One was having trouble with a tenant for years, finally was able to get an order to have that tenant evicted. Then the COVID eviction moratorium happened, and the tenant continues to stay there rent free. And so we don't think this is constitutional for a number of reasons. The first reason is it's a violation of your right to property. You have a right to use your property for reasonable purposes. And if the government is saying that tenants can live in your properties rent free, that's a violation of your property rights. It's a taking. Also, if you have a contract between a tenant and a landlord, the implication there is that each side has certain rights. The tenant gets to stay in the property, and the landlord gets to collect rent. And if you violate that and say, well, there's going to be no more rent collection or no more evictions, you can stay in without paying rent, or you can have the fees and interest for non-payment of rent erased, then that is a violation of the contracts clause. So we have these cases that we've been filing, and they're pending in the courts now. But what we want to do primarily is to win these lawsuits, even though the moratoria are starting to wind down, and most places except San Francisco and Los Angeles have ended their moratoria. We want to make sure that our clients that suffer these moratoria are the last ones that ever have to suffer such moratoria again. We want to get the courts to establish that these are unconstitutional. You can't take away people's rights. Even for public health and safety, there have to be some limits on what government can do to you.
Yeah, and just to throw in the scale of this as well, so that people understand, these mom and pop landlords, according to this Forbes article, represents about 77% of all of the small units out there, these rental units. So this is a significant portion, I guess, of the whole industry, and and a fair amount of these are retirees. So I mean, this is their income. They're getting.
This is the retirement income.
Yeah.
We're representing a gentleman named Howard Eiton in Los Angeles County, and he for many years ran an auto repair shop. Right, just a working class guy. He got to retirement age, and so he decided to retire himself, and he leased his shop to a franchisee of a national chain. Now that franchisee was having a little bit of trouble paying every now and then, but they thought they reached an accommodation. Then COVID hit, and the franchisee has completely stopped paying rent. And we're talking not about the rationale for the eviction ban for residential tenants was that they would otherwise go out onto the streets and catch COVID. But we're talking about an auto repair shop, which is, of course, a necessary business. But where is the connection between running an auto repair shop and COVID? It's really, really attenuated. And so what we're hoping is that we can win these cases, so the next time there is an emergency like COVID, and I have air quotes around the word emergency there, like COVID, that we will operate in a more of a constitutional manner rather than just this aggrandizement of power that the liberal left was so happy about. And if I could just mention one more thing, when you said that 70% of the landlords are small landlords, that's absolutely right. But what we're doing is making the cost disproportionately higher for these people that can't go to the bank and get financing for their big buildings. And this is going to mean that more and more small landlords go out of business. More and more small people are thinking of going into the rental business of buying a triplex or a quad somewhere. They're not going to do it anymore because it's just nuts to have this kind of regulation. So we're going to have more and more tenants living in properties that are rented by major corporations. So the liberals are just going to get the exact opposite of what they want through their heavy-handed way of pressuring the landlords here.
Yeah. Yeah. Seems a better characterization of the leftists, not the liberals, because this seems like a very illiberal thing to do.
You're right. I mean, look, I'm a classical liberal, if you will, in the classical sense of things, the way that this country was founded. But that term liberal has been co-opted, and I think, leftist is probably a better term to use.
You are a libertine.
No, libertarian, James. Perhaps, not a libertine. A little bit of a difference there.
Maybe I'm wrong on the definition of libertine. I thought it meant someone that was from the old original definition of the word liberal, which was someone that was interested in personal freedom and rights and that kind of thing. But okay, I'll look that up.
Okay.
As far as a scale goes of the damage, this Forbes article says it's hard to know, I guess, what the amounts are, but they said Moody's Analytics, and this is back in 2022, estimated that just in New York, the renters are up to $1 billion in arrears, so this seems like this is, a huge number potentially. I would assume this means, tens, 20s, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars that are just,
yes.
Yeah.
We're dealing with a fantasy land here because the proponents of these eviction moratoria and some of the courts are saying, well, there's no taking because we haven't excused rent. Well, we simply deferred rent. So when COVID moratorium is over, then you can collect the rent. Well, come on. Anybody who's accrued $10,000, $20,000 in back rent, now that COVID's over, should I write the check out the way I used to write the check out? No, that money's uncollectible. It's gone. And so, so you get to sue the government for the back rent. Yes, actually, that may happen. But it's just nuts to say that nobody's been harmed because it's just been deferred. It hasn't. People have been permanently harmed by this. Their retirements have been wiped out. We have people that are threatened to lose their own homes because they're not collecting rent on the rental property. And they'll have to move out of their own house because the mortgage company did not get a mortgage. There's no such thing as a mortgage moratorium. So people are going to lose everything as a result of this. They are losing everything.
It's just amazing.
I must apologize. James does not look to be anything like a libertine, and I apologize, James, for that insinuation, just because I completely screwed that definition up. And now hundreds of people across the United States are looking up the word.
Right.
Well,
libertine could mean somebody who has how do we say this gently, compromised moral values. And
so I just
puts the
really
pursuit of pleasure in front of everything else. So I'm not there.
A hedonist of ill repute.
But potentially.
I just insulted our guest, our distinguished guest, on national TV here.
Damn, Tim, this is the first.
This is a hard crowd. I mean, I thought this was going to be a friendly crowd. I get I don't know.
I am so sorry. I can't tell you. I just can't tell you how much. I'm so sorry.
Well, we're all learning.
That's right.
I pride myself on being someone that knows the English language, and there I go.
Well,
But you know, but
oh,
getting
go
back
ahead.
to the topic at hand here, you know, a big part of these problems exist because of the portrayal of landlords in the media. Is either you're a slumlord or you're this rich corporation who can afford these things, and nobody thinks that the landlord has a mortgage to pay, a mortgage on his own property and a mortgage on the rental property that is in dispute. Nobody thinks
Yeah.
about that. I mean, I'm speaking here as a landlord myself, that people always think that, oh, the landlord is a rich guy. The landlord have multiple properties and money coming out his ears and his backside.
Well,
And
Leon, there's something I wanted to say about that too, because as I was doing a little bit of the research for the show, I was trying to find statistics on the harm done to landlords. And it's really hard out there on Google because essentially these search engines, just like we're finding out maybe with all of this other chicanery going on with COVID and everything else,
yeah,
they tend to be all geared towards showing the harm to renters and not
right.
landlords. So it's like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to all these renters? But there's
Yes,
almost no articles out there that, or at least they're much harder to search for, than the damage done to landlords. So it's just, I don't know. I mean, certainly seems like there's a bias out there, like you're talking about.
very good
Yeah, I think
point.
I think
Very
we
good
can
point.
dump Google as a search engine these days. It's just really, I'm serious. Just dump them. I mean, go to something else. I don't know, the DuckDuckGo or whatever the other ones are that actually will do a decent search for you.
Yeah.
Well, Leon, my condolences to being a landlord. I used to live in a townhome that I rented out for decades, and I finally sold it in January because I was just looking at the handwriting on the wall, and I said, I am done with being a landlord in California. It's not worth the hassle.
California.
And I think my reaction is one that many other people are going to have. I didn't, it was a fine townhome, but it just, I could see the writing on the wall. Things are going to get worse and worse and worse for somebody trying to rent property. So who's going to
Yes.
do it? Corporations or the left will tell you there should be no landlord-tenant relationships. The government should own all the rental housing. And we know how well that's worked everywhere it's been tried.
Right.
Yeah. On an aside, sort of a parallel, but it seems like there's also been issues too with some of these issues with the number of homeless. And I know there's been a few plans like to try and put them in hotels. And then the problem becomes for the hotel owner, I guess, to try to get some of these people out later on once they get them in. I mean, I've heard a few stories like this that have happened in a few places where, they've had activists and others get in there. But that's sort of a little bit of a what do you call it? A tangent, but
But it is emblematic of the disrespect for private property rights and the owners of private
Exactly.
property.
Yeah.
When you can think you can commandeer their property for a greater public interest, whether it's homeless during COVID. And of course, the problem is with landlords, they were the motel owners, hotel owners were really in a hard strait because of the COVID lockdown. They couldn't rent to anybody or have any overnight guests, and they're going to go bankrupt. Government comes in and says, hey, why not rent to the homeless so you can at least have some income stream? Great. But the problem is people have to think whenever you take anything from the government and shake the government's hand, you withdraw your hand, and you don't have the same number of fingers and rings on your fingers that you had before. They get a piece of you forever.
Yeah. No, it's pretty crazy, but that does bring up another topic that I wanted to talk about on the show as well. And you talk about shaking hands with the government and coming away a little bit poorer after the experience. Student loan debt is one of those things as well. The government has promised all these people, hey, just go to school, don't worry, Uncle Sam's got your back. We'll help you pay up front on these loans, with loans to the colleges. And James, maybe I could get a visual on this. So the amount that we are up to debt on this thing, the bubble, is about $1.76 trillion is where we were at in 2022. And this is just, kind of crazy numbers that we're getting into. And so this has sparked the answer for the left is, well, just make it free then. I mean, this is essentially, what they want to do. So Biden was trying to essentially pay off part or all of some of these people's student loan debts. I think, the number has been bounced around quite a bit, but I think they were talking either $10,000 or $20,000 the last time around.
Mm-hmm.
And this is in front of the Supreme Court, I think, right now, the case is. And so we recently had Bernie and a whole bunch of other Democrats were there, and they were actually kind of spelling out what the problem. Their solution is terrible. I mean, it just goes on what Biden was saying. But do we have that video? My invisible hand, James. Do we have that video of Bernie?
Right now in America, we have 45 million Americans, young people, drowning in student debt. And I have talked to people all over this country who literally delay having a family, can't have any kids, they can't afford a car, they can't afford to have a middle-class life because they're drowning in their student debt.
So, obviously the left is seeing there's a problem. Their solutions are terrible. And if we could bring back the visual one more time here, I wanted to show, here's the debt going up over time, but you see the number of borrowers isn't really increasing. So, I mean, this just shows we're spending more and more money on these educations that apparently aren't even paying back, because when the people come out of school, the idea is they get a job that can actually afford to pay it back. And apparently a lot of these people who are getting degrees that the left favors aren't able to pay them back. So they're trying to support them, being paid off by the public. So what's going on, James, as far as in the courts with this? And let's see, it looks like you guys are fighting a lawsuit here. Where it looks like somebody was challenging it because they had paid off theirs, I think, and so they were upset because they had paid it off, and other people were getting the benefit who hadn't paid it off. Was that the issue here?
Well, is it slightly different than that? It was We represented an individual who was subject to having the student loan excused by working for a public interest
That's right.
nonprofit. And if you've worked for a nonprofit, then the student loan, there's a program where you get that debt excused. However, in some states, getting debt excused, as President Biden is doing, that is considered to be income, and you have to pay income taxes on that. So that was the key to have somebody with standing to sue, because in order to sue the federal government, you have to show some specific injury. And here is a student that was made worse off because of the student loan forgiveness, a very unique situation. The Biden administration essentially said, oh, well, in cases like that, we're going to change the rules so you don't have to take the money. So that made it more difficult for us to pursue our case. And in the meantime, the cases that are at the Supreme Court were filed by the state of Texas and some other borrowers who were saying that we didn't get the relief, but maybe in the future we could. Now, the case before the Supreme Court has two elements. First element that the court has to decide is, do the states or the individuals have the right to sue in the first place? And that boils down to whether they can show they have suffered some unique injury that's different from taxpayers in general. Just because you and I don't like a law doesn't mean we can sue to have it overturned, or a regulation. We have to show we've been injured in some ways. Now, in the student loan case, the states were arguing that one of the states, Missouri, has a administrative agency dealing with student loans. And that administrative body, or it's kind of an independent body, was getting its income from the servicing fees on the student loan paybacks. And those servicing fees were then in turn being given to Missouri for Missouri's education issues program. And Missouri is arguing that, look, with the student loan cancellation, we're not going to get this money from the servicing of the loans, and therefore we've been injured. It's kind of a unique and interesting and creative argument. And so the first question that the Supreme Court has, is that enough to demonstrate standing? But the more fundamental question that the court will get to, if it finds the states have standing, is, did the Biden administration have the lawful authority to do this in the first place? So where in the student loan program is the Biden administration given the authority to excuse debts of $10,000 to $20,000, depending on the recipient? And the Biden administration says we're getting that from the HEROES Act, which was passed during the Iraq War back in 2008 2008 or whatever it was, 2006, 2008. And their Congress passed a law saying that in a national emergency, and they're thinking about students being drafted or volunteering and going to Iraq, not drafted, but volunteering, going to Iraq, and not being able to pay the student debt during that period of time. And the law was passed to give those heroes, it's the HEROES Act, a pass and being able to pay their student loans. And it was a great idea. It was passed, I think, almost unanimously in the Senate and the House. Everybody thought it was a wonderful idea. But nobody thought that 20 years out, that somebody would think that a national emergency is a virus, and that should give carte blanche for the administration to forgive debts of $10,000 to $20,000, regardless of the impact that a particular individual was suffering because of COVID. In the Iraq war situation, it was going to be on a case-by-case basis for people that could show hardship. This one is given to everybody, hardship or not. You're young, you can vote Democrat. Hey, you get it, right? And it was purely a pre-election ploy on part of the administration. The timing is just, it's just, wow, just a few weeks before Election Day. What a coincidence that was. But it was clearly a way of buying votes, but it was also, there's no legal authority for that. You can't take a statute and read it to mean something that it doesn't say. The statute's pretty clear on the standards. It doesn't say you can forgive a loan entirely in circumstances like this. But that's what the Biden administration is doing, and that is the other issue before the Supreme Court.
Excuse me.
Yeah. Well,
But the states must demonstrate standing before the court takes up the second issue, or are they going to take up the second issue regardless?
Yeah. So the court has to demonstrate standing first, and that's going to be a tricky issue because traditionally conservatives like Justice Scalia were very skeptical of standing, of allowing people to come into court to challenge a federal rule or regulation unless they could suffer some real injury. And Justice Scalia wrote some important opinions limiting the ability usually of these left-wing environmental groups of coming into court suing simply because they didn't like a project. They had to actually show they were injured in some way. So the court has been skeptical of some broad assertions of standing, but that's what the court's going to have to decide first. And if it finds that the states have standing, then it'll go into the merits.
But okay, I'm fine. I understand the point. But the mere fact that this was not done by Congress itself, shouldn't that give standing to someone? I mean, this was the executive branch of government essentially making law, and that is not they don't have the authority to make law.
That, Leon, raises a really interesting issue about what happens when the administration breaks a law. Who has the right to go in and stop that from happening? And you would like to think that anybody who think it's unconstitutional would have the ability, or a legislature maybe, but the court has been very strict over the last few decades of limiting the ability of going into court. So when this loan cancellation issue first came up, we wanted to sue immediately, but we took a long time trying to figure out who might have standing to sue. And it's very, very difficult sometimes to do that. So it's troubling. You can see what is obviously an unconstitutional act on part of government. But the key for anybody trying to sue over it is to find somebody who's been injured that can actually get into court.
I see.
Wow. Yeah, and it's too bad too because they don't see it as an injury if all of our pockets are being picked. Apparently, that's not an injury. It's just
that is,
yeah, really.
Except for some very few exceptions, being able to just saying you're a taxpayer and my taxes are being wasted is not enough.
Yeah. Is there any kind of sort of legislative ideas or pushes out there to make it easier for people to challenge when the government is clearly exceeding its authority, even if they're not, even if they can't show direct harm to themselves?
there's no broad consensus to do that. Both conservatives don't like the liberals coming in, the left-wing groups, I should say, coming in and suing, and the left-wing groups aren't necessarily anxious to have conservatives or libertarians come in to sue. So there's not really a broad movement for that. It may happen with this case. The court may loosen up those rules a little bit when you have such a clearly unconstitutional act going on. But right now, it's not going to come from Congress to loosen up the rules. It doesn't seem to be something that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah. That might have helped during COVID. maybe we could have had some faster action, but yeah. Well, we're getting close to the end of our show, so let's get to our Knucklehead Noise Patrol, and that just will show us one more sort of crazy claim, crazy triumph that our government, our administration is taking credit for this time. And maybe we could get the visual on this, James. Let me jump over to that story. So this is just kind of beyond the pale of things you think. It's funny. Biden seems to be just slippery Joe when it gets to, avoiding responsibility for things. But I guess he wants responsibility for this one because apparently the White House is trying to take credit for Russia and China joining forces here, saying it's a sign of American leadership. We actually have a video clip of this. So, James, can you show me the first clip that shows Xi Jinping and Putin out there essentially talking about, hey, this new sort of axis that they're looking at? Friend, and that was Putin and Xi Jinping talking to each other after a summit. So, I mean, this is, potentially an alliance that's really forming. That's not the type of guys you'd want to see in an alliance. Now, if we could get the the video of White House spokesman Josh Kirby talking about this event.
As you consider this visit to Moscow by President Xi, is that it's also a manifestation of how much China and Russia know that American leadership on the world stage is back, and how.
So this is American leadership at play. There are no words for me. You guys have any words on this?
Yes, it's a tryout for Comedy Central.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there you go. There you go.
Well, I've been listening to a number of people talking about this recently. So in 100 years, or basically since Nixon drove the wedge between China and Russia that he did during his administration, not that he's a great guy or anything, I'm not saying that, but anyway, this has been to keep those two nations, Russia with its resources and China with its ability to pump out products, in this case military weapons of all different types. Now you've got this this perfect alliance for the two of them to move forward and take over. And maybe this is a good thing, I'm not sure. Take over the the world superpower together. And so, yeah, he's done a great job of making the future a less American centric place. And so, kudos, if you think that's a good thing for us to have diminishing power, if you think that's a good thing, then kudos to President Biden for basically creating it, because that's what it's going to be. Thank you. It's one of the worst things this guy could have possibly done, at least from the standpoint of the balance of power in the world. It's decidedly increasingly going against that of the United States and to this Russia-China alliance.
Well, I just wonder how much Hunter is shaving off of that handshake between Putin and Xi. How much are we going to find out later? It's kick to the big guy.
You got to remember this. Our illustrious leader once said that if we had a minor incursion into Ukraine, it was okay. Okay, remember that.
Yeah,
that was American leadership at work.
Leadership.
It really was.
Well, speaking of leadership, though, we thank so much James Burling for joining us today and the work they're doing at Pacific Legal to fight for our rights in the courts. And James, maybe we could pull up the page one more time to let people know about that. And if you want to check out more from on James, we interviewed him recently on another show, so go check that out. We encourage you, and you can find out more about Pacific Legal and a little bit more about James as well. James, did you want to tell us any more, any last words before we sign out?
Yeah, I'd like to leave you with a quote from Ronald Reagan. It shows you why we're doing what we do. He said, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we'll spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free." That's why we're fighting in the courts, and that's why we hope everybody will learn more about what we do at pacificlegal.org.
Yeah. And when he says men, he's referring to both men and women. It's just I think
whatever you may choose to be. Yes.
Not that I've been very good with word definitions today, but that's what I'm thinking.
I'll take that one.
And I've always loved that quote by Ronald Reagan. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Well, it certainly seems like a great quote to end the show on. Again, James, thanks for joining us. And for all of you out there, next week we'll be talking with the oh gosh, I have to pull up the sorry, don't have the thing right in front of me, but we will be talking with the Goldwater Institute. So stay tuned for that. And until next week, stay tuned and stay free.
Yes, indeed. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, always and forever.
Thank you for listening to the Knuckleheads of Liberty podcast. Find us on Facebook, Rumble, YouTube, your favorite podcast network, and at knuckleheadsofliberty.com.